working. Here. Okay. Good morning, Professor Tootle.
Good morning.
Boy, you're wearing a fancy hat. What does that say?
This is one that says "Knott brings the heat always," and it goes with my matching T-shirt that also
Yeah,
says the same thing. Knott
I compl-
brings the
I
heat.
completely love that. Are you the only historian in the country that has that hat and shirt?
Oh, no, no
Um,
doubt about that.
that's a good question. I think there are two families in America where uh, these hats and T-shirts have circulated. How about that?
Well, I completely love fandom. And so it's nice to show respect to our host today, who's not only a friend, but a very well respected and esteemed writer and scholar and professor. So I think that's just really cool that you honor him so well. Professor Knott, what do you think of the adoration from Professor Tootle? Is that good stuff or weird?
No, it's very good. Stephen invited me to speak at his college in 2016 or 17, somewhere in there. And I'd sent a message to him saying something to the effect of, I always bring the heat, and he's always remembered that. So God bless him for that. But let me just say, John, Stephen Tootle is an outstanding scholar, but he's also a true gentleman.
That is a
And those two don't always go together in the academic world. Stephen is something of a rarity. And I mean that with all sincerity. He is a first-class human being.
Oh,
yeah.
thank you.
I think that's a fact, and what's especially pleasing to me in that area, Professor Nod, is he likes and respects, and I believe is well respected and liked from people across the political spectrum.
Yes.
They can be very liberal and very democratic, or very, I mean, they can be gay, black, white, tall,
Yeah.
short. I mean, it just seems like he's Professor Tootle is one of those kind of characters that just you want to be. He's likable, and I
Yeah.
don't even think he tries to be likable. He just is.
Yeah. No,
I
I
have
agree.
enemies across the same spectrum, though. So
That's probably true.
maybe you just need to expand your sample size.
Fair
Might
enough.
get some different data there.
Fair enough. Now, Professor Tootle, before we begin the show, this is like the eighth show in a row that I've asked you. We're not going to talk about Epstein, huh? I mean, it's like all the news. Come on, Professor.
I don't
No,
have anything to say. I'm still
right
against pedophilia. How about that?
there you go.
My
That's a
position
good
on
answer.
pedophilia has not changed.
Okay, good. All right, but we are going to talk about any other current events. I mean, this is another big week. I'm wearing my Army shirt. This is the last day of Department of Defense in my lifetime. Now we're going to Department of War. Hooray! Right?
Well, I mean, I think that we should ask our guest.
Okay.
I mean, he was someone who spent most of his professional career at the Naval War College and has many friends and colleagues throughout the armed services. So he's the real expert. You need to be asking him these questions.
Excellent. So we do get a current event thrown in today. Is there any other current event though that we really should note for our extensive audience before we start with the professor?
Well, I don't know. Trying to note the horrors that come out of the current administration is like trying to drink from a fire hose. And I find myself, it's difficult to even catalog them because it's almost overwhelming because it's a horror show in almost every department, in almost every pronouncement, and it's easier to keep track. And maybe this is why I don't know. In some ways, it's almost like I feel like I feel more positively about President Trump because when he does something right, it's so rare that I can remember that. There's and so in some ways it outweighs the other 99 things that have happened in a day.
Did you
Um,
watch any of the RFK hearing yesterday?
ugh. I mean, I almost can't stomach it because again, I was listening to a summary. Sorry to take away from Professor Knott, but like
No
I was
problem.
listening to a summary of this by Megan McArdle from the Washington Post, and she started listing all of the things that are horrible that he has said in the past. And she said that when she when she read his book, she threw the book across the room, and it was a Kindle that barely survived.
Oh
Uh,
God.
and and it's like, well, what controversial things did he say? You know, in a way, if it was three things, I could remember it, but it was 28 things, you know, and that was just the summary. So it becomes overwhelming. You know, the fact that he's still defending the that pseudoscientist who put out that original um, paper saying that autism and vaccines were linked. You know, that alone, we shouldn't even need to know anything else. That is disqualifying. It means that you're a kook, like, and you should never be in public life. Uh, that his confirmation hearings should have been, you know, he should have had 10 yes votes. You know, like I'm fine with having kooks in represented in government, but it should be 10% because, you know, 10% of America is crazy and they deserve representation too, but they shouldn't be in charge of us. Like, I don't understand why the
You're
worst 10% of people in America are now in charge.
Professor, you're coming up with some great quotes that we got to pull out of this story.
Sorry.
So
Uh,
that's just awesome.
well, you
So
asked.
yeah, thank you. So,
Sorry.
and by the way, I had a huge debate. Almost had to block somebody because they called me anti-Trump, and I'm actually not anti-Trump. I am pro-Constitution. I am pro-limited government. I am pro all those things that Republicans have stood for my entire life. That's what I'm for. He just so happens to be the current president is against those things that I have been for all my life. But that's as an aside. A reaction to that?
Oh, I would just always say I've been pro-Trump for 2 days of my life, you know, which is his first day in office, both terms. I said, I hope
He's
he does a good
for the
job.
president.
And
Yeah, good.
then it lasts about 6 hours.
But you're not anti-Trump, are you?
I mean, insofar as it matters, you know, what am I supposed to do? He's the president of the United States.
Right.
You know, if I can bang my spoon on the high chair, like I just don't understand, you know, what that means.
Yeah.
And this is maybe, you know, we'll get to this later, but um, I want to know for Stephen Knott.
Oh, don't go there yet. Hold on.
Okay, sorry.
Hang on.
All
Hang
right,
on.
I'll ask it
Okay.
later. All right.
Thanks, Professor Tootle. We will have another current event show in another couple weeks from now. But Professor Knott, I wanted to do this intentionally, just to show you my frustration with what's going on in our government right now, because
Mhm.
I'm hoping that you're going to give some rational framework, some historical approach for me to put some just some common sense back into my legal perspective and some my philosophical tool house. I'm hoping you can give some maturity instead of the crazy stuff that we see in anti-Trump and pro-Trump and all that. And we don't have to talk about Trump all today. In fact, I hope we don't talk about Trump a lot today. But I do hope you can give some framework for citizens to hang their citizenship, where they can think about things in a different way than they do because of memes and social media and the 24-hour news network. We're delighted to have you again today. Just delighted. So now we're going to go to the official introduction. Welcome, Professor Stephen Knott. Professor Tootle is a big fan of yours, so I'd like him to give a little bit of framework and perspective of why he's such a big fan. Professor Tootle.
Oh, Uh, You know, he was one of I've often said this about certain figures. Like the first time you read Calvin Coolidge, you realize, like, oh, I can keep reading Calvin Coolidge. There's something about his mind that, you know, occupying his mind is a beautiful place to be. And I've often said that about like doing research in the Eisenhower Library. So, oh my gosh, I can't believe how organized his brain is. And I spent so much time studying Eisenhower. I felt like I didn't need to ask anymore what Eisenhower would do. I would just know because And there are a handful of historians who, the first time, and I will admit to my everlasting shame, Stephen Knott is actually not a historian. He's technically a political scientist, but well,
Hooray!
we're gonna. I I will readily admit that some of my favorite history books lately haven't been written by historians. And in fact, I've got one right here. I don't know if you've read this, Steve, but The Words That Made Us by Akil Amar. He's a law professor, and this is a great book. And it makes you wonder, well, I know my discipline has effectively been killed off. There aren't any more political historians. But the first time I encountered Stephen Knott as a human being, it was in the larger Ashbrook circle with Peter Schramm, and I just liked him immediately. He's a nice guy, and he's really funny. Another underrated trait among people in that Schramm circle is a lot of them are genuinely funny people, and and so I just remember thinking I really like this guy, and then over the years, I dipped my toe into a couple of his books, and I just found his mind to be one of those minds that's where I want to spend my time. And his work on Alexander Hamilton was fantastic. Years ago, I don't before we'd ever met, I was using the book that he co-authored with Tony Williams, Washington and Hamilton. I used it for um, my major book review assignment for my freshman students, and they loved it. And then when his book on the lost soul of the American presidency came out, I've been assigning it as the other book. It's not a textbook, it's a monograph, but the other book that all of my students read is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency by Stephen Knott. So, I have a few thousand students a year, and every single one of them reads Stephen Knott's Lost Soul of the American Presidency, precisely because it does the thing that you were saying you want in the introduction. It says, here's what happened. you know, the presidency had a soul, insofar as an institution can. There are some things that the presidency meant and what it was supposed to embody, and here's what happened to that institution over time, and here's how these current events fit in. And I will note, he wrote that book for an academic press. Sorry to keep going on, but he wrote that book for an academic press, which doesn't always get you a revised edition or a second paperback edition, but it immediately went into paperback, and now the second edition and a revised second edition is coming out or has already come out in paperback with updated, an updated and revised second edition. So
Well,
that in
Professor,
and of itself is an extraordinary accomplishment.
Professor, should we let
You should
ask?
let him talk.
Yeah. And why don't we start with that, Professor Knott? The lost soul of the American presidency, the decline into demagoguery, and the prospects for renewal. Do you mind giving us a verbal summary of your noted work?
Sure. Yeah, sure. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you, John. Um, yeah, I wrote that. I began to think about that book prior to Donald Trump's elevation into the White House. I actually started thinking about it as early as 2012. And the idea was, and is that the presidency has kind of lost its way, that there was a founder's conception of the presidency that I think was far healthier than the one that you and I happen to live under. But again, it predates Trump. And in fact, I make the argument in the book that we began to drift away from the founder's conception of the presidency. And let me quickly state what I mean by that. I think the framers, most of them, viewed the presidency as a unifying office, as a head of state above party, above even to some extent policy formulation. But it was the president's job to serve again as a unifying figure and to avoid stirring the partisan pot. If the founders were to come back today, they'd be horrified at the extent to which American presidents engage in personal attacks against their opponents. embrace a partisan agenda, occasionally even campaign against members of Congress. I mean, that would have just been unheard, and it was unheard of until you get to the 20th century. So we've moved away from that unifying notion, that more moderate, sober conception of presidential power. We moved away from it primarily in the early 20th century through the efforts of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Now, I will say you see some shades of this long before Wilson and Roosevelt in Andrew Jackson, and to some extent, even in Thomas Jefferson. The idea that the president should be the spokesperson for the people and should pay, particular heed to the people's concerns. In other words, in a way, presidential legitimacy comes from the support of the people, not from the Constitution, not from Article 2, but from the mandate that a president receives from the people. And TR and Wilson are going to embrace that with a vengeance. And Wilson particularly will lay out the intellectual framework for what I've called the refounded presidency. Again, it's a presidency rooted in public opinion, a presidency that puts a premium on rhetorical skills, the ability of a president to move public opinion, and basically to do whatever it takes to move that opinion. And again, a kind of disregard for the Constitution. I think Wilson and TR, but especially Wilson, did have a real contempt for the framers. He kept it under wraps for the most part, but he believed that it was time in the 20th century to radically change things, and in particular, to radically change the presidency. And you and I, again, are living under the after effects of that. So the road to Donald Trump, the road to what I see as a demagogic, conspiracy-mongering presidency begins about 100 years before Donald Trump was even elected. So I'll leave it there for now, John, but we can go further if you wish.
Okay, and I do have a follow-up question, but I want Professor Tootle to lead most of this conversation if he's so inclined.
Well,
Sure.
I don't know if it's because I've read so much of his work or I've been like one of the things that's funny is as I was trying to take notes as he was writing, every question that I had was immediately answered by him. And it's like this is
That's not good.
yeah, I thought, but I did have one thought, and it's something that I guess I don't know if you've ever talked about this before, because I wonder if it would be a difference between us, and so I'll just float it out there and see what you do with this. But um, two things. First, um, I've been reading a lot of Woodrow Wilson's 19th century works, and there's a lot more radicalism in there that I suspected. And I'll just leave that out there. He really was, but I completely agree that he's hostile to the government of the United States. He wants to he wants to a sort of a
Hostile to the government or the structure of
he
government?
wants a legal revolution. He wants to use the structure of the United States in order to undo the structure of the United States. I mean, he wants to. He's like many other progressives. He's hostile to the Enlightenment and believes that the United States should not have been founded on Enlightenment principles. And so, what he wants to do is to, and it's confusing for students because one of the things that Wilson also does is he uses these terms and then gives them new definitions.
Hmm.
He calls it the new freedom, but it's not really the new, it's not new and it's not freedom. But he defines these terms in these long academic tracts. And then when he uses this rhetoric, it makes us believe that in some ways that he has, and this is where I want to get to this, maybe disagree. I don't know if it's a disagreement, but I'm starting to really make a much more clear distinction in my mind between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And even though they share common rhetoric, there's a real a real underlying difference in how they use these words. In that, what Theodore Roosevelt is doing, and again, this is just my take on it, but what Theodore Roosevelt is doing is he's saying this is the language that is being used by academics and intellectuals today. I need to use this language in order to explain how the founding principles already address these issues, why we already have the tools we need. Again, not in every case. I'm overstating it for the sake of contrast. Whereas what Woodrow Wilson is saying is, I'm going to use the new language of scientists and social scientists um, in these longer academic tracts, and then I'm going to use the sort of common language of freedom in a way in order to get people to get on board with rejecting the founding and structure of the United States. Um, I don't know. I just
Oh,
wonder how they treat Hamilton, and then
yeah,
how we see this come out when Franklin Roosevelt comes along and he says, "Well, I'm trying to blend together these two things," and you're like, it just becomes your brain is turning in somersaults, um, which
yeah,
maybe that's what the New Deal was supposed to do. But anyway,
Well,
I want to
Professor
put that out
Knott,
there and you just react to that however you want.
yeah,
Professor
sure.
Knott, can
Yeah,
you also translate it into layman's terms,
yeah,
instead of like master's degree in history, folks, people just out on the street like me. If you can put Professor Tootle's comments
yeah.
into language that we would understand.
Well, I would agree with Stephen in part that Teddy Roosevelt had a reverence for individual framers, particularly Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, particularly the Federalists. TR did not have a high opinion of Jefferson, but he really admired Washington, Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris. And in that sense, I think that does separate him to some extent from Wilson. I think what Stephen was saying was you have these two progressives, one Republican, TR, one a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Of the two, during their time in power, Wilson, I think, absolutely was the more radical, for lack of a better term, of those two. Now, and what we're getting at here, John, is again, particularly in Wilson's case, he did not want to see the United States or see our system of government locked into an 18th century, as a lot of progressives were fond of saying, horse and buggy conception of government that was not suited for the industrial era. That the United States had gone through radical changes in its economic sphere, just like evolution. All these progressives were caught up in Darwinian notions of evolution. For individuals, for species to survive, we all have to evolve. Governments need to evolve. And Wilson was arguing that our government needed to evolve fairly radically, that the founders had done a good job in terms of winning independence and in protecting individual liberty, but that was no longer enough. Due to the rise of industrial behemoths and corporations, etc., you needed an activist government to check that economic power. And it was up to the president in particular to lead the charge against these economic, Gilded Age barons. So hopefully that brings it a little bit down to street level. And let me just add, John, the only thing I might differ with Stephen on in terms of Wilson versus TR is by 1912, I think TR has gone very, very much in a radical direction. In some ways, I would say even beyond Woodrow Wilson. I mean, TR flirts with the idea of electing judges. He flirts with the idea of allowing public referendums to overturn judicial decisions. It's all he's bought in completely to the idea that the majority should govern and that the courts in particular have turned out to be an enemy of the public, a bulwark against public opinion, and that's not healthy. So that's
So,
where I would break with Stephen over the Wilson and TR
and
distinction.
go ahead and do a follow-up question in a second, Professor Tootle, but Professor Knott, I'm confused.
Yeah,
Right now, it seems like there's a majority of the Republican Party that is enthusiastic about President Trump's initiatives for the
yeah,
exact same reason. They believe our system is antiquated and it can't
correct.
compete against the global China, the communist corporate kind of competition. And then we can't have all this process. We can't have courts make decisions. We can't have we've got to have a strong authoritarian leader to be competitive, or otherwise we might not be a nation state anymore. So it seems like the arguments have flipped now. Instead of progressive, they're now conservative. And the whole thing confuses me. Is that
But it is very confusing, John, because I think I would argue, most of the people who support Donald Trump I would not classify them as conservative. They do have a kind of disregard for the judicial process, any processes, really. They want to see, as you put it, John, they want to see somebody get things done. And there is this kind of authoritarian inclination there, it seems to me. And that is, if I'm accurate about where they are, then that's not healthy, because that means our constitutional system is under duress. I mean, just to give you a specific example, from a week or two ago, I saw a poll that said a majority of Republicans are hoping that Trump runs for a third term. You want to talk about anti-constitutionalism? I mean, it doesn't get any more blatant than that. So, John, I don't. So yes, he's the Republican president. Yes, the Republican Party since Teddy Roosevelt arguably has been the more conservative of the two parties. But that is no longer the case. I mean, you can make a case, and I think I would make it, that the folks who are defending the rights of judicial review, who are defending due process, who are defending a somewhat unpoliticized Justice Department, they're in the Democratic Party. They're in the former, party that was most associated with 20th century progressivism. So things have flipped, in my view, entirely.
okay? So I'm not mad. Oh,
You're
not
not
mad.
mad.
I
You're
am
very
in.
sane, John.
Okay. All right. Professor Tootle, back to you.
Um, yeah, I completely agree that about his characterization of how TR where he goes by 1912. The only thing I'd say is that he's still grounded in history in a way, and in the founding in a way that Wilson is not.
You're
So
right,
even in
Stephen.
the campaign speeches of 1912, when
You're
he's
right.
making arguments to the American people, he says, "We're doing this because this is what Lincoln would have done," and
Yeah.
because but during, especially late in his presidency, um, he made a lot of, he was very critical of the Wilsonian temperament. And my old advisor had this article in this book called Progressivism and the New Democracy. And he just had this one sentence that always stuck with me. And that the one thing that progressives had in common was they all had a uh, a vision for the uses of social science in governance. And but this is one of the few times when he's listing off the traits of progressivism that he says, and most of them wanted them to identify the problems and have that be the roadmap for solutions. And I would say that that's a distinction that I always made between TR and Woodrow Wilson. At least from late in his presidency, he would say things like, you know, uh, social sciences or journalism, these are really good for identifying problems. But when we're looking for solutions, we can look to the past and to American values when coming up with solutions. Whereas Wilson and many of his followers and much more radical followers would have said, the only thing we need to do with the American system of government is uh, change it so that
That's fair, Stephen. That's a fair distinction.
so
Well,
that social science is telling us here's where the problems are, and we should completely reform government because the social sciences are telling us that we need to. So it provides both the outline of the problem and says here's what the solution is. Where so just again, this is dancing on the head of a pin for most normal human beings, but it's something I've always, because I mean it's something I've always wanted to ask you about. So, but the other thing I want to run past you is something that Megan McArdle said. She's a columnist for the Washington Post, and she was on the Dispatch podcast last week. And I threw this out to Moser to see what he would do with it because it's just been haunting me ever since she said it. Only elites care about process. And I keep thinking to myself, what if that's true? And because when we characterize Trump voters, in my real life, there's something that really rings true about this, and we talked about it all the time. If you've ever read a single newspaper article about Donald Trump, you're a member of the elite. You know, most Americans don't read anything about politics, don't follow anything. So all they hear about are results. And so they hear about like, oh, we're deporting this guy who might or might not be, a human trafficker. Who cares? Right? Well, that's a process argument. And they hear all they care about is directionally, do I sympathize with the result? Oh, he's going after Harvard? Good. I hate Harvard. He's
Yeah,
firing the lawyers who went after him. Makes sense to me. I'm just, and
yeah,
in order to object to those things, you have to get to that next level where you say, look, I think it was wrong that he was prosecuted and singled out for prosecution, but uh, we have to care about the process. Uh,
yeah.
and I
So
just
what's
don't.
your reaction to that, Professor Knott?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I have to say I share Megan McArdle's view that and not, I'm going to sound like an elitist here by even saying this, but that most folks really don't care about the process or something called the rule of law. It's just too abstract. And it's unfortunately, I think, partly a result of something Stephen and I have spent our lives trying to counter, which is just a lack of basic civics information, just a lack of understanding about what the intentions of the framers were, why we have separation of powers, why we have something as anti-democratic as judicial review. All of that is just, unfortunately gone by the wayside for most Americans. And we're paying the price for that right now. And not to be all doom and gloom here, but I think we are in the midst of a real test. And it is a test of whether this notion of the rule of law, of limits on governmental power, limits on the American presidency, the sort of genius of the American system is now being tested, and it's a real stress test. And I have to confess, I'm not sure how we're going to come out in the end. I wish I could be more optimistic. I try to be. I have grandchildren. I want them to grow up in the same country that I grew up in. But I have to say, I'm deeply, deeply concerned due to the fact that most Americans, I think, don't particularly care about abstractions like due process and do look simply at results.
So, gentlemen, let me push back just slightly to get your reaction. I remember as a 7 or an 8-year-old, my father teaching me that you can disagree on all sorts of stuff. And he wasn't talking about abortion and gays and taxes as an 8-year-old. He was probably talking about who gets to ride the faster bike or what time you have to get home or something. He said people, humans, can disagree on all sorts of stuff over the substance. But if they feel cheated by the process, that wasn't fair, their vote didn't count because it was rigged, they
Yeah,
will remember that forever. So be very careful of hurting people over fairness or process type of issues. You can argue all day over stuff and you forgive each other. I've had that in my head my whole life that everybody cares about process. The referee on the sports team, the sports game.
yeah,
And I think people intuitively get whether it's fair or not. In fact, I think that's one of President Trump's strengths is he constantly says it's unfair, even if it isn't. And people get that. Well, I don't want to be treated unfairly. And so I want to push back on that I think people do care about process, but we're just not speaking about it in layman's terms. We're doing
yeah.
it in highfalutin ways.
Well, I hope you're right, John. I mean, the thing that scares me is uh, we're trying to avoid focusing on Trump here, but look, he lost the election of 2020. He lost it. He had people in his Justice Department saying, no, Mr. President, there's no evidence of fraud. I mean, it was across the board in the administration. People were telling him, no, Mr. President. And what does he do? He takes to social media and he tells his folks to show up on January 6th, as he put it, in quotes, it will be wild, end quote. And he spends that time stirring the pot. That is a contempt for process. It is a contempt for the rule of law. It goes right to the heart of our democratic process. And I find that absolutely unforgivable. And the fact that he will go on to pardon every single person, including those who attacked police officers on that day, again, this is unforgivable in my view. And it makes me less optimistic, John, that it's certainly among his supporters, there is an appreciation for any semblance of process or fairness.
Yeah, that's a good retort back. I don't even have an answer back for you. Yikes. Professor Tootle, back to you.
If there is some uh, thing that will save us from sounding like elites and that will end up maybe making us more optimistic, it's history to know that
Yeah.
um, American ideals are not supposed to be elite. They are things that can be taught, and they are things that have been taught. And we began in this country as an ideological nation state, meaning we started as a group of people who drew a big circle around ourselves and said, "This is what we believe," and so it's not impossible. But but one of the things that Professor Knott and I, as he mentioned, we've spent most of our lives engaged in civic education because we believed in it even before it was cool. Uh, and uh, just even before it got us all the chicks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but um, you know, these things are difficult, but they can be learned. And when we say elites, I don't want you to picture people on the Harvard yard. I just mean it's stuff that your city councilman used to know. And I don't know that my city councilmen know it now, you know? When I was a kid, my city councilman could have explained this stuff to me. Uh, and uh, and the loss of uh, the loss of trust in institutions, in particular the media and education, um, the takeover by people who I believed are hostile to the United States in those elite institutions. We're just feeling that now. You know, politics is downstream of culture, and we've been sort of naively thinking that we could not pay attention to our elite institutions. Um, and now we're reaping the whirlwind. Um, I do think that there's another source of optimism is I still think that the American people are trying to vote for the most normal candidate. It's just that they haven't really had the normal candidates to vote for. I mean, there's another way of looking at these last few election cycles. How did Donald Trump get elected? Well, the crazy people were united, and the second choices were unacceptable. You know, in some ways, Donald Trump could have never been elected president if Bernie Sanders wasn't running against Hillary Clinton, and if Ted Cruz hadn't been the alternative. You know, so sometimes this stuff is just luck.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know.
Reaction to that, Professor Knott.
Yeah, I mean, I recoil just a little bit of Stephen about the opponents. I mean, the two people he beat happened to be women.
Oh, yeah.
Um, One happened to have been a woman of color. Um, I think that played a very, very significant role in both of Trump's victory. The one person who beats him is another old white guy from Delaware named Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm straying here a bit, but
No, I think there's something to that. I mean, it's the same thing. What if Mitt Romney hadn't been Mormon?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. And by the way, it is shocking to John, having followed some of your social media, the fact that Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee as recently as 2012 is truly astounding.
It is.
Because that party is now, that part of that party, the sort of Bush, H.W. Bush, Romney, McCain, Bob Dole, they are just gone. And I'm not a fan of Trump, as you picked up, but his transformation of the Republican Party is truly, truly remarkable, and how rapid that centrist establishment party just collapsed, completely collapsed.
Yeah, won't there be, and I'm doing a transition intentionally here because of time. Won't historians be writing about this 10-year, this decade? I mean, there'll be amazing books issued from this
Yes,
20,
no
30,
question,
100 years from now, right?
no question. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. The
So
fact that Liz Cheney and her father are outcasts in
right.
the it's just absolutely astounding.
it is remarkable. So, Professor, let's switch gears slightly and go to one of your other books, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Can you
sure.
can you tell us what lessons Hamilton might be able to give us today? I'm hoping for again wisdom for the common citizen based off our history. So,
Sure.
you'd like to take that, and then Professor Tootle, you'll do all the follow-ups.
So Alexander Hamilton, in my view, was the most impressive. Well, I'd give George Washington top billing, but that combination, that alliance between Washington and Hamilton that Tony Williams and I talked about in our co-authored book was, in my view, the most significant relationship of the American founding. And the reason I say that is because I believe they built the foundation that ultimately will lead the United States into becoming an economic and military superpower and a truly united states, a truly united nation, as opposed to Jefferson and Madison, who were, I think, very much fond of the notion of states' rights, fond of the notion of the United States remaining something of an agricultural nation. I do think Washington and Hamilton especially, had a vision of the United States that came to pass. And in my view, we've all benefited greatly from that. The fact that you and I are sitting here today in comfortable homes, connected on an internet, they never could have envisioned that. But I do think Hamilton's America was an America of innovation, entrepreneurship, and had a vision of, see Stephen moving his Hamilton bobblehead into place. they had they had a vision of the United States that came to pass. We've all benefited from it. We've been focusing on some problems here for the last 45 or so minutes. And there's no question there are some problems. But I would still say this is a regime. I don't like to use that term. This is a political order worthy of defending. And it's primarily a political order that was, for the most part, shaped by Federalists like Washington and Hamilton. And let me add one thing, John. And this is important to me, just as because I have an interest in this issue. It was frequently said that Hamilton, especially, and his fellow Federalists were the elitists of their day. And Jefferson and his political party made a lot of hay with that notion of Hamilton and his so-called Federalist elitists. But that is one of the myths that has unfortunately persisted to this day. And just to give you one quick example, John, the Federalist Party had a far more progressive, if you will, record on race than Jefferson and the so-called champions of the common man did in the Democratic Party. If it actually reached the point where the Jeffersonians were calling the Federalists the Black Federalists because of their association with free Black voters in the Northeast. So that's, I do view race as a consistent problem, a consistent thread throughout American history. And some of the more positive founding statements and founding actions comes out of the Federalist Party in terms of trying to deliver on the promises of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. So that's part of my admiration, and I think why my fellow citizens should admire people like Hamilton and the other Federalists of his day.
Lovely. Professor Tootle.
Yeah, and again, I've been so influenced by Professor Knott over the years. It's hard to know if I'm just repeating your ideas back to you, because and I also teach them, so it's hard to sometimes.
Yeah,
I mean, so I apologize in advance if I'm just quoting from one of your books and I stole it in
sure.
my own lecture. But I can tell you that what you really helped me do is refine what it is that's so special about Hamilton. And that is, and here's just my take on it, that what Hamilton's special gift was is that he could set aside what, and most people can't do this. They can't set aside what they wished the world was like. And this was, Jefferson's, he could dream up and invent ways that he thought the world was. But what Hamilton could do is stop and say, look, this is how the world is. And the first step to thinking about um, what the world could be is to first recognize what human beings are like. And in some ways, it's hard to describe because I try to tell my students, like, his ego was so large that he had no ego. He was so where his confidence came from is the fact that he could predict things. And the reason why people trusted him is not because they liked him, it's because everything that he would say was always ended up being right. So he's like, yeah, you're right. It would be wonderful if we were tough enough that we didn't have to kowtow to the British. Guess what? We have to kowtow to the British right now. This is what we have to do because we're too weak, and nobody wants to hear that. Their pride says, "Oh no," all of the Jeffersonians got to puff out their chests and say, we shouldn't side with the British. And this is why, Hamilton was always accused of being a monarchist and all that. But what he actually accomplished, he said, the fact that we're on the internet and talking to one another and we live in Hamilton's world, he could see that it was possible that human beings could live in peace. And that the only way that human beings could live in peace is to create a self-selecting meritocracy with peaceful processes for the destruction of every form of aristocracy. If I were to sort of summarize what I, what he was able to see, that's what makes it possible for us to be a great and powerful country. It's to the extent that we've implemented that vision. And if anything, my studies over the last 5 years have only strengthened seeing that thread as it goes through American politics, particularly in the 19th century, because I didn't know anything about the 19th century for most of my life. So I've been studying the 19th century a lot in the last 5 or 10 years, and wow, do you just see that um, in almost every decade of the 19th century, as well as in the 20th, almost repeating verbatim these ideas from Hamilton. Um, I mean, I always thought it was interesting when I heard Dwight Eisenhower say it, or Calvin Coolidge, or something like that, and I thought, well, that's interesting. But you come to see, oh no, there's this entire political and intellectual tradition of people who remember Hamiltonian ideas in almost every decade I've studied in American history.
So,
Um,
Professor Knott, what do you think of your protege? Sorry to call you a protege, Professor Tootle, but what do you think of his comments and reflections on Hamilton throughout history?
Yeah, I think Stephen is dead on, and for much of American history, um, first with the Federalists, then with the Whigs, some Whigs, Northern Whigs, Then, with the Republican Party as founded by Abraham Lincoln, Hamilton's ideas, Hamilton's thinking have reached down to us to this very day. And you do see, for the most part, until recently, a real Hamiltonian streak in the Republican Party, particularly prominent presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, as Stephen mentioned, Coolidge, Harding, Hoover were all Hamilton admirers. So that Republican Party, which in some ways is no longer with us, they were the heirs to Alexander Hamilton. John, so Stephen is correct. And John, let me add one thing that I didn't mention, and that I think is of vital importance to all of us today, whether we're so-called elites or whether we're the man on the street, is that Hamilton warned us repeatedly about the dangers demagogues present to Republican small r government. More, I would argue, perhaps, well, Madison's a close second, but Hamilton understood in his reading of history that Republicans had a tendency to collapse due to the machinations of those who rise to the top of the political system by appealing directly to the public, by flattering the public, by circulating conspiracy theories that the Republic takes at face value. And once they achieve power, once they're in positions of power and they no longer need the people, then they turn on them. I would encourage all of us to pay attention to Hamilton's warnings about the dangers of demagoguery, about the dangers of political figures who are nothing but raw ambition and lack any sense of principle. And as Stephen pointed out, Hamilton had principles. He was incredibly ambitious, but he had principles and he stuck to them. And one of the things that upset him about Aaron Burr most of all, and Burr will go on to kill him in that duel, is that Burr, in Hamilton's view, and in the view of others, had no principles whatsoever. He was nothing but raw ambition. And I can think of a few modern political figures who I put in that category as well.
Yeah, boy, what a great summary there. Woo! So, Professor Knott, I have a political science degree and a law degree, and so I'm not a have some education, so to speak. But demagoguery doesn't resonate with me. It's not a term I use in
Okay,
daily life. And I think you explained it in your answer just now, but can you even not dumb it down, but can you talk about it in layman's terms?
sure,
So we can, and then also transition to your new book, if you don't mind. Then we're going to open up to Q&A.
sure. Yeah, excellent question, John. And I sometimes make the mistake. I don't always define it that clearly, in part because it is one of those terms. It's like Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography. He knew it when he saw it. I think we know demagoguery when we see it, but we need to define it more than that. And I would define it this way. It's appealing to people's passions, their
Mm,
base passions, their lowest emotions, appealing to people's fears. And in particular, that usually is accompanied by a scapegoating of those who are not quite, quote unquote, one of us. Those can be racial groups, unpopular religious groups. They can be economic groups, by the way. You know, some of the Jeffersonian tactics involve sort of portraying their opponents as friends of the rich and the well-born. That has always resonated in American politics. And so it's a scapegoating, it's a targeting, it's an appeal to racial, ethnic, religious hostilities, and it can be remarkably successful come election day. So, John, I hope that at least gives some sense of what I'm talking about.
yeah, it does give me some handholds. Professor Tootle, a question, a retort to that. Then let's go to his future book.
No, he nailed it. And this is another case where, as I was making notes, he was saying exactly what I would have said, but he was saying it better. Um, the only difference in how I would have responded is I would have said, um, we ha- the, what all demagogues do is they all reject what Hamilton said in Federalist One. Um, Maybe one of the most important little phrases in American history: reflection and choice. Really
Thank you.
thinking about what Hamilton meant when he said, "Here's our chance, but we need to create a system based on reflection and choice. Now, when I'm explaining it to students, I always say we all have feelings and we all have desires, and our government, and Hamilton and Madison in particular, understood that people have feelings, but people are also capable of reason. There's something in the, part, we now know that our brains literally evolved in different times. We have the part that says, go eat and, live out your feelings. But then we also have this other part of our brain that means we're capable of reason. So how do you take, again, how human beings really are and translate that into a system of government? You say, well, we need to make sure that the American people never get what they want, which is sounds like, it's always strange for students to hear that because they think they've been taught maybe their whole life that the purpose of our government is to turn the desires of the American people into action. And a demagogue is someone who says, I know that's what you want, and I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to take your desires and turn them into action instead of forcing reflection. And reflection, think about what it actually means. That we don't just have our feelings, we give ourselves enough time to engage the other part of our brain that says, I'm the feeling has passed. Now I'm going to engage logic. Now I'm going to engage context. Now I'm going to think about what's actually best for me in the long term. And then I'm going to make a choice, which is once I'm going to think about this after passions have cooled, and reflection and choice. And what's so dangerous about a demagogue, again, Madison and Hamilton understood this, is they're the ones giving the people what they want.
Yeah.
And if he hadn't said the word, well, I don't know if you use the word amoral, but I always just say like, and this is why he hated Burr. So I'm just repeating what you said, but it's the amorality. It does. Who cares what right and wrong don't exist. This is postmodernism before postmodernism existed. There's no such thing as truth. All that matters is power, and I've seen it in the few politicians in my lifetime, but they had always been outliers until the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Well put, Stephen.
Well, further reflection on that, Professor Knott. Everything you said is correct?
Yeah, reflection, choice, the Federalist, that's I think the very first paragraph of Federalist One is where Hamilton says what Stephen mentioned. We have a unique opportunity here. We can create a government based on reflection and choice, not on accident or force. And I think it's one of the more beautiful and moving and profound paragraphs in the entire Federalist Papers. And the only thing I would have, Stephen put it really well, both Madison and Hamilton wanted a system of government that allowed for deliberation. And a demagogue, as Stephen says, will promise easy, quick solutions. I'm going to cut through the red tape. We're going to get things done. That is incredibly attractive and also incredibly dangerous. And Hamilton and Madison recognized that from the start.
Ah, what an important conversation we're having today. This is just really, I'm
Good,
thankful for you both.
good.
Professor Knott, if you'll take just 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm sorry to give you such short amount of time to talk about your new book, but if you don't mind laying that groundwork out, then we're going to open up to Q&A for whoever's joined us.
Sure. So my new book, it'll be out next spring, is called Conspirator in Chief, The Long Tradition of American, oh God, I'm forgetting the subtitle because the editor just changed it on me. I think it's The Long Tradition of Conspiracy Theories in the American Presidency. And so I look at a series of American presidents, concluding with Donald Trump, who I have to say is in a league of his own. So when I mention some of these names, I'm not equating them necessarily with Donald Trump. But I do think there is a tradition in the executive branch. It begins with Jefferson. Jefferson wouldn't directly spread conspiracy theories about Hamilton and the Federalists, but he had plenty of willing lieutenants who would do that for him. Andrew Jackson doing the same thing, portraying John Quincy Adams as an elitist, from the Northeast who didn't care about the man on the street. The same kind of class warfare That resonates to some extent to this day. You know,
You know what?
Jackson will,
Can I just interrupt this one part
yeah,
about John Quincy Adams? I always
sure.
made me laugh was the idea that he had defiled the White House with gaming tables and
Pool
gambling
table.
furniture
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
because he had a chess set.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
right.
that he sipped silver, what was it,
Yeah,
sips silver, French soup from silver spoons or something.
right.
Sorry,
No, no problem. Andrew Jackson referred to John Quincy Adams as John the Second.
yeah.
So the two Adamses were part of this New England aristocracy, if not a monarchy. I mean, just crazy stuff, but it resonated with the public. Andrew Johnson, similar tactics against the so-called radical Republicans. And then in the 20th century, I focused on Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Harry Truman, the latter two, whom I have some respect for in certain areas, but unfortunately had a tendency to portray their Republican opponents as fascists. And I don't think Thomas Dewey necessarily fits that bill. Then I focus on Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Again, Trump's very much in a league of his own, in my view, much more destructive, uh, much more in terms of his output of circulating conspiracy theories, whether it's Ted Cruz's father killing President Kennedy or Antonin Scalia having been suffocated to death by someone using a pillow. I mean, it's endless, endless, endless. And then I conclude a chapter with some presidents who I viewed responded to the better angels of our natures, who avoided, for the most part, and I'm looking at George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, William Howard Taft, who's one of my favorite and unheralded presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, and I include George W. Bush in there, and that's going to piss off some of my liberal friends, but Bush from day one refused to point the finger at Islam, refused to particularly point the finger at Islamic Americans, and he paid a political price for that, by the way. So he avoided sort of circulating conspiracy theories that one needed to question the loyalty of some of our fellow citizens who happen to be Arab American or Islamic Americans. So that's the core of the book, John.
Professor Knott, how do you define the difference between a conspiracy theory and a campaign slur or a campaign lie?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, John, and I'm not sure I'm going to be going to be able to address it adequately both here and in my book, but I make the attempt. I make it clear that American campaigns have never been, I mean, they've been ugly, if not from day one, with George Washington might have squeaked by. Well, even Washington had his anti-federalist haters. American campaigns have always had an ugly side to them, going negative. Where I draw the distinction, John, is that once the individual makes it into the White House, does that trend continue or does
Mm.
it stop? And to me, the ones that I mentioned as the sort of conspirators in chief carried those practices into the White House that served to divide the American people. In my view, in a sense, they were violating their oaths by engaging in those kinds of destructive practices. So there's no growth. There's no recognition that, okay, now I'm in a different spot. I can't play that ugly game anymore. I'm the head of state of a great republic, and I'm going to act accordingly.
God, I love that answer. I accept your answer. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.
I
Thank you.
love that. Professor Tootle, forgive me by going to Q&A right now, and I'm sure you'll be able to interject here anytime. Morgan, do us a favor. This is the first time you've joined us. You don't have to ask a question. Take yourself off video if you do. But you get the privilege of asking the first question of Professor Knott.
I don't know if I have any questions because this is just a really new, well, it's not new for me. I used to be very political growing up, very, very political. And I've been like starting in seventh grade, just in campaigns and stuff with the Republican Party. Um, my life has taken a giant turn as an adult and battling a lot of mental health stuff and actually really focusing on what actually matters in life has made me look just want to look deeper at a lot of different things. So that's why I'm here. But because it's what most people like, we can sit all day and talk about, well, presidents used to be like this and now they're all demagogues and nobody cares unless they can get their lattes and iPhones, and it's really sad, but nothing is going to change until people start recognizing that neighbors are important, community is important. And um, I was raised in a very isolationist type of family. You know, nobody raises my children. You know, they wouldn't let us have therapists, or they never sent us to daycare, stuff like that. Um, and I think that's how a lot of America is now. They are so isolationist, and a lot of it is because they're afraid to reach out and ask for help just from their neighbors. And so until we have a leader who is actually going to inspire people to be the best versions of themselves and to reach out and say, hey, you might have brown skin, but I noticed that, you know, you're struggling to carry your groceries in. Let me help you. Like, it's that simple to notice that everybody takes a shit and it smells. Everybody has problems. And until people feel safe to be authentic, nothing will ever change. So we got to figure out how to make people feel safe to be authentic, in my opinion.
I love this show because you're a real person, Morgan, and I'm just thrilled you decided to join us today. So, was that a commentary on what you heard today, or do
It's
you also have a question?
Well, no, I don't have any questions. It was just a little commentary, but I've just been really grateful to listen to you, Professor Knott. It's really been a great
Thank you.
treat. Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you.
So, Professor Nod, do you have a retort to that commentary? Is that, I mean, because that's what Morgan is, the average
Yeah.
American.
In terms of, breaking the barriers down that seem to exist between, I mean, Americans are, we hear this term quite often, many Americans are alienated from one another. The internet seems to
Exacerbate.
hasten or foster that alienation, younger people spending all their time staring at a screen, not getting to know one another. I mean, Morgan is, absolutely dead on. What I've tried to do and what Stephen has tried to do, we're involved in a program teaching elementary and high school teachers about basic civics. Now, maybe I'm already straying there, Morgan's concerns, but I do think if we are going to rebuild our communities at the local level, and by the way, I think Stephen and I have been consistent on this. That didn't come out today necessarily, but we are believers in local government. We are believers in federalism. In other words, keeping power as close to the people as possible. But that
Hmm.
is going to require to sort of regenerate that. I think that's going to require enhanced civics education, and that's where I devote my time to, Morgan. And I think it
And
at least
I value that. And I have totally shifted. I used to be more of a, I don't know how you describe it. Um, I used to, like, everybody is virtue signaling, all of that stuff.
yeah.
What I think really what it comes down to is we need to make, oh, I just lost my train of thought. There we go. This is my neurology. It
That's
it might
okay.
come back. It
Happens to
might
me
come
all the
back.
time.
There we go. It might come back. Let
It's
me
all
just read. Anyway, go ahead.
it's all good. And jump back in if you'd like as we move along here for the next 15 minutes. Professor Tootle, quick reaction to that, or we should go to Jeff.
Go to Jeff. I agree with. I could. This whole show could have just been. I agree with everything Stephen Knott just said.
I love
Excellent.
shows like this.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, Dugdale, you probably are more inclined to agree with Professor Knott on concerns about the American psyche and what we're willing to tolerate. I have great hope in America. You and I have argued about this, that maybe, gosh, maybe people do just want power and what they want now. You don't have to ask that question. You could either ask that or another of your choosing. But Jeff, you're up.
Well, first I'll comment that of course you make me go after Morgan because Morgan, what you said was fantastic. Um, and I also have to say that I'm envious that you're wearing a jacket because it's like 90 degrees here and I have to have a fan on me at all times.
It is a
Um,
cool day in Colorado, outside in a
Uh,
jacket. I love that, Morgan.
yeah. I'm definitely encouraged by Professor Knott's characterization of the original philosophy of the executive branch. And so I'm going to be a little unfair and ask Professor Knott to get his crystal ball out and suggest a path back away from the brink of unitary executive. I mean, what would it take to, for a president to say, these are powers that I was never supposed to
Yeah,
have, and I will prevent everybody after me because the pendulum keeps swinging further and further, and eventually
yeah,
it breaks the clock. So how do we back away from that brink?
yeah. That's a terrific question, Jeff. And I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer. I
Where does
scholars
it start? How about where does it start?
Sure. Well, scholars are good at analyzing problems. They're not always good at offering solutions. Um, but I think this would, what I'm about to say might help. And that would be, and this is not going to be popular with some folks, we have a presidential selection process now that has absolutely zero guardrails to it or zero filters. In other words, if you have enough name recognition, you have enough financial support, you too can run for president. And one of the strengths of the pre-20th century presidency and presidential selection process was that there were people involved in saying, yeah, okay, this guy's got a drinking problem. This guy's somewhat unbalanced. This guy, on the positive side of the ledger, this guy understands the law. This guy's not going to do damage. He may not be up on Mount Rushmore, but he's not going to revolutionize things. He's not going to put us in a position of danger. So we had a system initially, the early electoral college, that was supposed to foster that. That fell by the wayside, but then it was replaced by strong political parties and strong political leaders within those parties. Now, it wasn't ideal. They occasionally picked some real mediocrities, but they didn't pick a lot of folks who did great damage, I would argue. And we don't have that anymore. There's no screening process left. So you end up with a situation, take a look at 2016. Bernie Sanders came extremely close to defeating Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat and never has been. And yet he comes this close to winning the nomination of a party that he doesn't belong to. And then Donald Trump on the other side had a record in New York City of supporting Democrats. I'm using this as an example to say there's no more party control anymore. You may hate the idea of going back to the old smoke-filled room, but again, at least they know who the people who really shouldn't be anywhere near the Oval Office should not be nominated by these parties. That's gone. That would be one small step, it seems to me, to restore some semblance of a controlled presidency, a healthy presidency that's not out there going rogue. I grant you, Jeff, that's not the total solution, but that would be an important step.
Well, I have a practical question follow up on that, and then you can go back, Jeff. Practically, Professor Knott, the only way to put power, I mean it kind of rhetorically, but the only way to put power back in the political parties is to overturn Citizens United. Am I wrong? With a
That would
constitutional
help.
amendment.
That would help. But look, John and Jeff, what I'm advocating here is unlikely to happen
Okay.
because we've all bought into the idea that the more openness and the more transparency and the more the common folk have a say in picking a nominee, the better. And I completely reject that idea. I know that sounds like elitism, but I think we have a lot to learn from a system that existed prior to the 20th century that produced a somewhat restrained presidency. And by the way, one of the effects of this might be that Congress would get itself back into the game because some of these party leaders would also be members of Congress. And they're not going to put somebody in there who they know is going to run roughshod over them. So that's another possible benefit, Jeff, in response to your question. But I acknowledge what I'm advocating is the chances at this point in history are slim.
Yikes. Jeff, follow up, or are you good?
Think that a strong third party would be a better solution than strengthening the two parties again?
Uh, again, Jeff, this may be unpopular. My view is no. I think there are benefits from a strong two-party system that we saw in the course of about 120 years of American history. To me, a third party, I just don't see that as the answer. I would say that I think part of the reason Biden won in 20, got the Democratic nomination in 2020, is that Democrats, he wasn't necessarily the first choice of the ideologues of the rank and file. He wasn't Kamala Harris. He wasn't Bernie Sanders. He wasn't Elizabeth Warren. He was seen as more of a compromiser, seen as somebody who might be able to win over a sizable number of independents. And
Which
I
he
think
did.
that was borne out in 2020. So you can, I think, get, if we can get these existing two-party system back on track in terms of recognizing that this is not a popularity contest, that you actually have to select somebody who can govern. To me, that's the answer.
Professor Tootle,
Thank you.
reaction to this conversation.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I can't think of anything I disagree. There are only a couple things that because again, like always, he anticipated almost everything I would say. The only thing that I have on my list of answers that he didn't say is that I spent most of my career defending the unitary executive. I mean, saying like I, the Constitution says all executive authority, so that's what it means. And I would just say, like, eh, I still don't have a problem with the unitary theory of the executive. My problem is when the executive oversteps and starts
Right.
interfering with the legitimate powers of the other two branches, and especially the role of Congress in terms of being the dominant branch of government. Uh,
President needs to faithfully execute the laws that Congress puts
right.
in.
And
Right.
the only thing I've heard lately, and I admit I haven't even really thought about it because I heard about it for the first time last week, is the potential of a constitutional amendment to clarify what it mean what all executive authority means. You know, and I guess the devil will always be in the details. If I were to support a constitutional amendment that said
Uh,
something along what's being discussed is something along the lines of what the president must enforce the laws that Congress has passed. you know, and that's what executive authority means, rather than having that be an interpretation. And in terms of uh, how political parties could be strengthened, in addition to the overturning of Citizens United, which regulated only the fundraising of political parties, I think we still haven't had a full argument among constitutional scholars about the idea that is it actually constitutional that state legislatures can interfere with the First Amendment rights only of political parties and say every other group of human beings in the state of California gets to elect their own officers. But you, the Democratic, the political parties, you must use our process for how you select nominees. Because I think that if that question was widely debated, I think we would see that it's a little bit weird that for some reason it's okay to interfere with the First Amendment rights only of groups of people who call themselves political parties.
It's an interesting point. Professor Knott, any reaction to that?
no, it's a very interesting point, unique point, and one that I wasn't familiar with until Stephen mentioned it. If I could just quickly add, John, back to Jeff again, it is very tempting, particularly in the time we live in today, to look to alternative political parties. Part of the reason I stick to, perhaps it's a hope that I should have abandoned long ago. Maybe this is where my thin streak of optimism actually comes out, is that political parties in the past were big tents, to use a cliche, and they sort of fostered the idea of compromise, of coalition building. They're not that way today, but I think they could be. And that internal compromise and coalition building would benefit all of us and remove us from the current politics of, politics as a blood sport where it's all or nothing. And I see two political parties fostering the idea of cooperation and coalition building. My God, I think we need that today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point, Professor. Bart, I'm sorry to get to the end, but we have an attorney that usually asks our clients, our guests, questions. Um, Professor Knott, be careful. Bart Miller wrote the state of laws of Colorado laws for over 30 years. So,
Nice.
Bart, what kind of comment do you or question do you have for the professor?
Here's my question, and I'm kind of picking up on something that Morgan has put into the comments for our show here. I think I agree with everything you've said about the need to somehow rejuvenate coalitions that can essentially, I guess, rejuvenate the political parties in the country. But one thing that Morgan has raised that I think is a really, really good question is, what do you do about the public perception that political parties have been really corrupt actors in our political process over the history of the country?
Well, what I would do is argue that that is misguided. I mean, yes, political parties are flawed. All human institutions are flawed. I mean, we're flawed. So anything that we build or enact or erect is going to be flawed. But I think over the broad course of 200 and wherever we are, 30 plus years of American history, well, I guess we're approaching what, 250 for the Declaration. So, but nonetheless, we've got a pretty good track record. There's still a lot to be proud of. Again, here's my optimistic streak coming out. We're a great nation. And I think that's in part due to a political system that's evolved over the years, that fostered compromise, fostered coalition building, fostered respect for electoral results, which is why 2020 was so upsetting to me. Trump's the first president in American history to be as blatantly, accusatory that the whole system was rotten, that it was stolen. He still says it to this day. He's absolutely wrong. That's incredibly destructive. But again, political parties, I think the two-party system we have has been a remarkably healthy development. And I see us, if we splinter, if we go away from that, I see even further factionalism, further balkanization, if you will, of the American political order.
Just as a side comment, Professor Knott, you won't like this at all. I have been involved in 2 attempts to form a new political party because I'm so disappointed with
John, if you were at the head of it, I'd support it.
You're kind. I kind of think today that the Republican Party is split in at least 2. I mean, almost irreconcilable differences. And as you pointed out early, so is the Democratic Party. So they're parties in name only. And a lot of rational people are not in either party. They've decided they're going to just be independent for now. So I don't quite see the way out of that mess. We are almost out of time. So Professor Knott, if you can give some, and then you're going to have the last bite of the apple, Professor Tootle. Professor Knott, overall, the state of American citizenship and the state of American politics, you would recommend reading 1 or 2 of your books, and then you'd also recommend what else to as citizens? What should we be doing to get us back on course? Because I know you're an optimist. I know you believe in America. End us on a positive note.
Sure.
You'd like us to do.
Yeah. Well, Stephen held up a book earlier, American, sorry, no, the title isn't The Words That Made Us. I'm not as far into that book as Stephen is, but it's one of many piled next to my bedside. I would strongly recommend that book. I'm going to recommend a book that nobody's probably ever heard of. It's called In Defense of Politics. And it's by a guy, an English, I think he was a political theorist, political philosopher, named Bernard Crick, Crick. This is not a book that's going to keep you on the edge of your seat. It's not a, but the point is that Crick writes this book, I think in the 1950s, could have been the 60s, in which he reminds people that the friction, the contestation of democratic politics is frustrating. It can get ugly at times, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative found in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. It's just a very powerful statement in defense of politics. And Crick argues that politics, in the truest sense of the term, can only exist in a free society.
Ah,
There's no politics in, Xi's China, or I would even argue in Putin's Russia, and certainly
right.
not in North Korea. So we get frustrated with politics here. We get frustrated with political parties, but we shouldn't, because it's a sign of health that we have these things. And I think all of us need to be reminded of that at this time, especially.
I think that's a lovely point. I'm so glad you brought that up. Professor Tootle, we are out of time, but you can take a minute or two over. Wind us up.
Well, first of all, I'd say to anybody listening to this, I just bought the only good used copy of it off of Amazon. So while he was talking, so you're all going to have to suffer from buying the ones with more highlighting and underlining in them for higher prices, because I just got the good one. Uh, I do like. I guess first things, just thank you. Not just thank you for being on the show, but sometimes I wonder. You're a scholar, you're toiling away on these books, and you might wonder, is anybody ever going to read this?
Yeah.
Is anybody getting anything out of this? And so I
Yeah.
feel like I need to remind you, like I read your books, and not only do I read your books, they make me happy. I derive real joy from them because it makes me happy just to know that you're out there thinking these thoughts and putting them into books. And I think that in some ways, I want to praise a book that we didn't even mention, Rush to Judgment. If that book needs to exist, and you're the one who did that, and you deserve to be thanked because someday somebody's going to pick that book up, and it might be 50 years from now, and say, "Oh my gosh, we had this completely wrong." And there was one guy out there who thankfully documented not that George W. Bush was a saint, but that the way in which we discuss his administration is completely wrong. And I also really, was happy when you mentioned Taft, because I've always said like the quality of Taft's ideas they kind of suffer from his terrible writing style. And if you can manage to get through his, really long, torturous sentences, the quality of his thinking was absolutely superb. And so I'm just glad that you're out there, glad
Thank you,
that you're
Stephen.
doing this work. I appreciate that you're doing it because it's the kind of stuff that makes it possible for me to go out and teach my classes. I can answer questions, and I can hopefully, not just fill my students' heads with lies. I did want to give you one um, bite at the apple of to tell the story of the one mistake that's in the Hamilton musical before we go, because
Yeah.
people always ask anytime
Yeah.
you come up, people always ask, "Oh, what does he think of the musical?" It's sort of I always know that it's in the back of people's minds, and so I've heard you answer this question before.
Yeah.
Tell the story of the one mistake in the Hamilton
Sure.
musical.
Thank you for all you said, Stephen. My wife and I went to see the Hamilton musical 10 years ago this day for the
Oh
first
wow.
time on Broadway. We've seen it a couple times since. I actually had some minor influence. The book that the musical was based on Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton relied extensively on my work, so I'm proud of that. But the one mistake in the musical you should all know is when the character of Hamilton looks at the audience and tells this story that Martha Washington named her horny tomcat Hamilton in honor of, well, in light of Hamilton's alleged serial adultery. Completely false, never happened, based on an article that was a satire, has since been transmitted down through the ages as truth. It's not truth. So I love the musical, but that was an era of
There is no horny Hamilton cat in history.
that is correct, John. And
Bombshell.
thank you, John, by the way, for all you do. It's these kinds of discussion groups that are going to help us right the ship.
Yeah, Professor, we this is I think our 130th conversation over the last 4
Wow.
years. And Professor Tootle and I met at the American Enterprise Institute, and they had the idea. Arthur Brooks said, "We're not going to be able to change America in Washington. We have to do it out locally. We have to have real people talking to each other."
Yeah.
So that's what Professor Tootle and I are doing, is trying to get real people to talk to each other about public policy with a history bent. And I think you're our most prominent guest so far,
Thank
and
you.
dearly appreciate your time.
Thank you, John. And Morgan, you're right. The major takeaway from today is no horny Hamilton cat.
That'll be the next.
I
That'll be
told
the
you.
next T-shirt, right?
I am
That's the next hat I'll be wearing,
incorrigible.
right?
I am incorrigible. I know
No,
my
you're
mom's staring at me like, what the hell are you saying? Like
Yeah.
my mom is up in heaven just yelling at me. But yeah, I am incorrigible and I refuse to be anything different. So
good for you.
On this noble note, Professor Tootle has his LinkedIn bio, or maybe I think it's his Facebook bio, is just a sinner in a world of sin. And now we have to end with Morgan's compliment on it: Hamilton, no horny Hamilton cat.
There you go. There you go.
Professor Knott for not ending for ending in a human way rather than in an elitist way.
I appreciate you all. This has just been such a treat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Well done, Professor Knott. Well done, Professor Tootle. Thanks for being citizens. Let's continue to make America great. I mean, we can do this,
We could
right?
actually do. Yes.
We can
Thank
do
you
this.
all.
Have a great day, you all.